We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. This week we're focusing on the race for Supreme Court. Now later in the show we'll sit down with Marquette poll director Charles Franklin for more on the state of the race. But we start this week with our sit-downs with the candidates running. Last week we brought you our interview with Liberal candidate Susan Crawford, and this week we share our interview with Conservative candidate Brad Schimel. We caught up with him during a campaign stop in Sauk Prairie. So you've run for statewide office a couple of different times here,
Yep.
and for a county judge as well. I'm always fascinated by politicians, that moment that switch kind of flipped in your mind, and you're like, yes, I want to run.
Yeah. I had been asked by a lot of people after the 2023 election to get in this race, and I really wasn't convinced it was for me. I thought somebody else can do it, but nobody else was coming forward. And what flipped the switch for me was after I watched, the promises on the campaign trail. They don't always get kept. They did this time. When the Liberals took the majority of the court, they then went ahead and kept the promises they'd made on the campaign trail. That was the moment when I knew somebody had to get in this race who was willing to run a long race so you can get to all 72 counties, which I have, and I'm running laps. I've been in this very building to campaign more than once this campaign, and I'm just circling the state, getting to as many voters as I can, working my tail off, because that's what it's going to take.
So you've heard anecdotally from voters, they don't necessarily know what the Supreme Court does. They say, oh, it's a court that handles Supreme cases like murders. How would you describe your role on the bench and what the court's role in Wisconsin is?
There's two things here. One is what the role the court's supposed to have. The role the court is supposed to have is to simply interpret the law the way it's written, apply it the way it's written, and not legislate from the bench. There is, unfortunately, and this is what's motivated me to get in the race, is we have a court that is now legislating from the bench. They don't like what the legislature has done, so they're changing it. That's a problem, because for voters, when you vote for your elected official, like your state assembly representative, that's a local thing. You can have a movement in your community to get somebody elected or get somebody elected to replace them. It's hard work, but it's doable. When you're talking about a Supreme Court justice, that's statewide. Locally, you have very little control, very little influence over that, and it's a 10-year term. It is the longest term in Wisconsin government, and so they're there for a long time. So it's important that we have justices that are going to be objective, that are going to have humility and respect for the limits on the power they have, and rule based on the facts and the law and not their own opinions. Judges dress differently than everyone else in the courtroom. And that's not because they're more important. It's symbolic that we are different than everyone else in the courtroom. Everyone else is an advocate or a litigant. The judge is neutral, just like an umpire in baseball. We also take a different oath than other elected officials, because in our oath, there's something extra that others don't have, where judges promise that they will, or they swear that they will administer justice without regard to persons. And that doesn't mean we don't care about people. What it means is it doesn't matter who's sitting in front of me. It doesn't matter the identity of the litigant. What matters are the facts and the law in the case. That's it. And you can be the richest or the poorest or the most popular or the least popular. Whatever the case, it doesn't matter who you are. It's all based on the case, not the identity of the person.
So you've run statewide as
Yeah.
a Republican. You have that R next to your name, but
Yeah.
you also have to kind of protect that neutrality of the bench. How do you do that?
Oh, it's easy. Well, first off, my roles as a Republican were as district attorney and attorney general. In both of those roles, I was enforcing the law the way someone else wrote it. As a judge now, I interpret the law the way someone else wrote it. So I have the same kind of respect for the rules that someone else, another branch of government, made. But it's also actually remarkably easy. When I take the bench, it's actually kind of a sanctuary in the courtroom, where everything in the world now is politics, 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 right? It's a lot of noise, with the advent of the internet especially. Now in my courtroom, nobody gets to use their phone. Turn them off, or I'll take them away. But it's a politics-free zone. Let's talk about the facts of the case. Let's talk about the law. It's liberating. So it's not hard to put politics aside. And I mean, to be clear, everybody has political baggage, right? We all have opinions that we've grown up with or we've developed into. I've had past experience as an elected official. My opponent, she was chief legal counsel for Governor Jim Doyle. That's a very partisan position right there. We both come with this. What has to happen is that you have to be able to make a commitment that you will be objective and you will apply the law without regard to politics.
Are there any court cases that have been decided where you would agree with the legal analysis to get there, but you might disagree with ideologically?
Well, you know, there's a case that, if I go back to my attorney general days, there was a case that actually we defended a Wisconsin statute all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won, but we didn't like the statute. We thought it was too much power in the hands of government, but my job wasn't to make that decision for the voters. My job was to defend the law the way the legislature passed it, and it had been a long-standing law. So we defended it, we won. But after we won, the great thing that happened was the legislature came back and modified that law. They recognized that the way the courts interpreted it faithfully to the way it was written, that they needed to make an adjustment to it. And they did that. That's how the system should work.
When we come back, more from our conversation with conservative state Supreme Court candidate Brad Schimel. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We're continuing our series of sit-downs with the candidates running for Wisconsin Supreme Court. This week with conservative candidate Brad Schimel. Now, the Waukesha County judge previously served as the state's Republican Attorney General. We pick back up with our questions here regarding comments Schimel reportedly made during an interview with Wausau radio station WSAU, saying that 4 liberal justices on the state Supreme Court were, quote, driven by emotion during oral arguments on abortion. Now, those 4 justices are all women. We pick back up our interview there. I do want to ask about those comments with WSAU saying that the liberal justices on the bench were driven by emotion when they were hearing that abortion case. Do you have any reaction to
This is all nonsense. So for these 4 justices, nobody can criticize them without them playing this sexist card. They are qualified lawyers and jurists on the bench, and it is fair game for someone to disagree with how they've behaved on the bench without that being sexist. There's nothing about their gender. A male could be in the same position that any of them were, but plainly they had lost their objectivity in this case. That was the point. Watching those oral arguments, they plainly did not control their objectivity, and they were ruling and arguing with the lawyer based upon their own opinions, not on focusing on the law. That was the problem with the questions and the way they were asking their questions. This is a nonsense attack. This is as old as time. To go at, if somebody's right about, if they land the hit when you talk about something wrong that you've done, just deflect. Talk about something else. Don't focus on your misbehavior. Focus on something else, and that's what they're doing with this.
I want to touch on stare decisis really quickly. How and when should a judge or a court overrule past precedent?
Yeah, we should do that very reluctantly, because the legislature passes laws. They can change those things, but there's warning. You know, there are hearings. There's a build up to it that people can predict what's happening with the change in the law, and that's driven by the voters, of course. When courts flip things back and forth, then we lose stability in our state, and nobody knows what the rules are going to be next week compared to right now, today. And it happens like that when a court does it. It happens without a hearing where people can be heard to talk about the pitfalls or the challenges to making this change, or maybe the benefits of making the change, or safeguards that need to be in place. Courts can't do that well. Courts should stick to precedent as well as they can, and respect that, because that keeps stability in the law. And if the law needs to change, then that should be going through the legislature, not the courts.
So, looking at voting rights, for example, is there an affirmative right to vote in Wisconsin, and how and when should that be enforced by a court?
An affirmative right to vote?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, yeah, of course. A citizen has the right to vote, yeah.
And what extent should a court kind of weigh in to protect that?
Well, it is the job of the legislature to put in, if you mean, are you speaking about voter integrity issues or vote integrity problems?
Kind of all-encompassing.
Okay, because that really is something that should be structured by the legislature. That is put in their hands to make those determinations, because justices can't do that very well on the court. For instance, I was in Adams County last summer after the Dropbox decision got decided, and a voter there asked me, well, but the court required in this decision that you have to put a camera on the Dropbox. And I said, no, they didn't. There are no structures, there are no rules. The court just decided that Dropboxes should be legal, and now it's kind of the Wild West. Now it's to someone else to figure out what the rules are. When the legislature makes a rule change like that, the legislature can build in those safeguards to make sure that this isn't something that blows up in our face. That's why the legislature is the better branch, and it's the designed branch in our constitutional republic to make the laws.
On recusal, for example, a case that you might have handled as Attorney General, when that, or if that were to come to the Supreme Court, how and when would you decide whether to recuse yourself in that case?
Well, if it's a matter that I have a personal or a member of my immediate family has a personal interest in the case, of course I must recuse. Otherwise, a judge at any level, including a justice, has a responsibility to search their conscience to make sure that they can hear the case fairly and objectively. You know, we ask the same thing of every juror that comes into a courtroom to serve on a trial. They all have a history, they all have a background. And the question I ask for them is, you have to search your soul and be sure you can set your history aside such that it won't influence your objectivity as you hear the facts in this case. That's the same thing a judge or justice should do. We should hold ourselves to at least the same standard as a citizen coming in to serve as a juror.
And when you look to judicial philosophies, any jurists that you idolize that you'd want to embody their philosophy on the court at all?
Boy, idolize is a strong word. I'm frankly very fond of our current Chief Justice, Annette Ziegler. I think she's been outstanding. She's not always predictable. I know she's going to follow the law, but when it comes to interpreting the law, I don't always know exactly where she's going to fall on that. But I think she's also been a really dignified leader of our state court. I am a big fan of, everyone says, all conservatives say Justice Scalia. Of course. Now deceased Justice Scalia was an amazing leader who stuck firm to his conservative judicial values. I'm also a big fan of Justice Clarence Thomas. He's got an amazing story. Came from, his ancestors were sharecroppers. I think his grandfather was a sharecropper. And he came up in relative poverty and rose to be a distinguished member of the United States Supreme Court. I think that's an amazing story. And I also like about him that he doesn't overdrive the lawyers. There's some justices on state and federal courts that never let the lawyers get a thought out. Justice Thomas, when he asks a question, there's a good reason for it. He's not trying to have a debate or make an argument with the lawyers, and I like that about him. I function that way in my courtroom too. I try to let them have their say. I have my questions, but I try to let them complete a thought because they worked hard to get their case to me.
Our interview there with conservative Wisconsin Supreme Court candidate Brad Schimel. Now you can see the full interview with him as well as with Liberal candidate Susan Crawford up online at channel3000.com under the For the Record tab. Now when we come back, we break down the numbers in the state Supreme Court race with Marquette poll director Charles Franklin. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We're now a little more than 3 weeks out from that race for state Supreme Court. And that April 1st election will also see the race for a state superintendent of public instruction, as well as a statewide ballot referendum to add photo ID requirements for voting into the state constitution. Now, taking the temperature of Wisconsin voters is the gold standard of Wisconsin polling, the Marquette Law School poll. Now, the only numbers that we will see in the spring race were released earlier this week, and we spoke with poll director Charles Franklin. Well, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the interesting thing about this poll that kind of caught my eye is you don't do the head-to-head thing.
Yeah.
You do favorability for each of the candidates. Why did you decide to go that route?
I think you see that in the numbers that 38% didn't know enough about Brad Schimmel to have an opinion. 58% didn't know enough about Susan Crawford to have an opinion. If that many people don't yet feel familiar with the candidates, asking how they're going to vote right now would be good for clickbait, but it's not really informing us very much about what's going to happen over the next month. So I thought it was more important to focus on what people know and what they don't know. And then we asked about 10 questions about Supreme Court issues. We asked about 10 questions on the schools and the superintendent's race. So we tried to focus on the policies that are part of both of those races rather than put the focus on a head-to-head number, which I think is not telling us very much today for where we'll be in 4 weeks.
So if you were to do the head-to-head today, for example, you say that that number could just fluctuate so much in the next 3 weeks?
It could fluctuate a lot. Also, in some of the polling that we have seen, there's not a lot. You're seeing substantial percentages saying they don't know how they'll vote at this point, which again is perfectly consistent with what we're seeing on familiarity with the candidates. So, you know, I ask a lot of head-to-head questions in a lot of elections, but I think with this spring election and what we know about when people really tune in and start to get familiar with the candidates, it was premature to ask about that one question, and instead I put the investment in asking about policy questions related to the Supreme Court and related to schools.
Gotcha. And so we're chatting off air a little bit. This will be the only poll that you run in this race. Is there anywhere else we should be looking for when we're kind of, trying to get a sense of the state of the race?
Well, believe me, I'm interested in the state of the race as well, but I'd be looking for polls that come out 2 weeks before the election rather than 4 weeks before. I'm only aware of one public poll that has come out, but I hope and expect that there will be more released over the course of the rest of the campaign.
Gotcha. And I will say certainly not any that will come close to the quality of the Marquette poll.
Well, I appreciate that, but there are a lot of quality pollsters out there. We don't have an exclusive contract on that.
So when we look at the favorability, though, from your poll, from your numbers, does that kind of weigh into, or can we extrapolate what voters are thinking from that?
I think you can see something, and that is that the net favorability, more favorable or more unfavorable, that's very close for 3 of these candidates. For the Supreme Court, Brad Schimmel is about plus or minus, is about 1 point underwater. Susan Crawford is about 1 point above water. We've got a big margin of error on these things, and so that's essentially, people see them equally favorably and unfavorably. There's not a big advantage. In the school board's race, Kinzer is actually the one that has a fairly positive rating, but she's also the one with the biggest that say they don't know enough about her. And so again, you can say, well, it's a smaller group that have an opinion of her, but those that do have an opinion are a bit more positive than for the other 3 candidates. But none of them are clearly in trouble by being deeply underwater, and none are super far ahead, though Kinzer does have a significant advantage with that smaller group of the public.
So this is a very low turnout, kind of low information election along the way. It seems like a pretty blank slate for these candidates to run on. Is that the kind of thing where in the next 3 weeks or so, the litany of attack ads that will kind of firm some of those things up?
I think that we'll certainly see more ads if they just continue with the nature of the ads we've been seeing, which is sort of how well each of them did as a prosecutor, and then their attack ad saying how badly the other candidate did. I don't know that that's very informative to voters about how they should vote when both campaigns are making essentially the same claims, both for themselves and against the other candidate. What we do see, though, that's the other side of the coin, is a little over 80% say they know that the balance of the Supreme Court is on the line in this election. So they understand that the stakes are high for whether there'll be a liberal or a conservative majority after this election. Around 50% say they personally are very concerned about how the election turns out. So it's not that voters are dismissing the importance of the election, it's that they don't feel like they've gotten enough information about the candidates yet.
Our conversation there with Marquette poll director Charles Franklin. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Late this week, the Wisconsin Elections Commission met to discuss the results of that agency's investigation into the 193 City of Madison ballots that went uncounted during last November's election. Now, the commission ultimately voted during a Friday meeting to allow that investigation to continue.
I am troubled. I am genuinely troubled by the number of profoundly bad decisions that are recited in these materials leading up to Election Day.
The commissioners said Friday that they want to depose the Madison clerk as part of that continuing investigation. And the WEC set another meeting for March 12th to provide guidance for local election officials ahead of that April 1st election. Now, the City of Madison also says in a statement that they are working on their own internal investigation into how those ballots were misplaced. And that does it for us this week. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.